It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Sangeet Paul Choudary, who has turned into a valued collaborator. And I told you at the beginning about some of the book project that we're working on. And what we'd like to do is road test one of the toolkits that Sangeet has spent a lot of time building out. In his prior life, he was working on the platform strategy for Intuit, and now spends quite a bit of time advising startups and implementing these tools in practice. So with that,
you get to see my whole presentation backwards. Okay, so yeah, we've been talking a lot today about platforms with intent versus accidental platforms, and I strongly believe that platforms can be built with intent. Okay, sorry. The other thing I believe is that platforms are the new lemonade stand. We're seeing 16-year-olds build platforms today, and we're seeing them getting acquired for $35 million by Yahoo and other companies. So we need to explain platforms in a way that a 16-year-old can understand it, and that's been one of my goals by thinking about how do you go from an idea to a platform business model end to end. And typically, platforms are complicated businesses because you're bringing a lot of different sites together, then making them interact with each other. But how can we go about building that beast in an orderly and controllable fashion? That's essentially what I'm going to be talking about. And I do a lot of work with startups, and these are some high-level patterns that I've seen across startups that have succeeded and that have been avoided across startups that have failed. So that's what I'm going to use as the bedrock of what I'm going to be talking about. When you think of platforms, the fundamental way, as Jeff mentioned today, the fundamental way in which platforms differ from existing business models is that the firm no longer controls the 100% of the final value creation that is consumed by the consumer. Value is actually created in the ecosystem. And that's the fundamental point about the platform is that value creation and exchange occurs in the ecosystem. The firm essentially just provides the infrastructure and creates the conditions for that value creation and value transfer to happen. When we think of platforms, this is probably the first image that comes to mind. We think of the Apple App Store, the Android platform, and typically this is the structure of a platform. You have the platform acting as an infrastructure and creating the conditions for developers and users to come together and interact with each other. So developers create the apps, users consume the apps, and this is reminiscent of what Marshall shared earlier in terms of the two-sided market model. What I would like to point about is gradually, as the internet is becoming more and more pervasive, and as platform business models are coming up more and more on the internet, we're not seeing two distinct sides, we're seeing two distinct roles. If you think of Airbnb, the same person can be the host and the traveler. So it's not two distinct sites anymore. It's overlapping sites, but two distinct roles, producers and consumers. Think of YouTube. The overlap is even more. A lot of people who consume videos on YouTube actually create videos as well. Finally, think of Twitter. If we think of this as a multi-sided platform with multiple roles, we still have producers and consumers, and when we are writing 140 characters, we're doing the production. When we're looking at a Twitter news feed, we're doing the consumption. So one thing that I would like to start with is stop thinking about markets that are being connected, but think about roles, because you might just be targeting a single market, but you might be enabling 5 different roles within that market. And that's possible because of the internet, because the tools of production are gradually becoming more and more democratized. Everybody can produce, and so everybody can essentially play a producer role, even though all of us have traditionally been essentially consumers. So that's the first thing that I want to point out about how platforms are moving today. The second thing I want to draw attention to is the fact that a platform essentially enables an interaction to happen. Just a few minutes back, Jeff Jarvis had mentioned about the quote from Mark Zuckerberg that you cannot create a community, you can only enable interactions that are already happening. So the platform's goal is not that of a puppeteer. The platform's goal is essentially to create the conditions that enable interactions to happen. And because we call this information technology, these interactions essentially get started through information. And that's what I like to call the seed. Every interaction between a producer and a consumer starts with the seed. If you think of journalism, the content is the seed. If you think of a marketplace, the product information is the seed. If you think of anything related to content, the minimum unit of content is the seed that is required to be created on the platform for the interaction to happen. And so when we're building platforms, a very simple and focused way of building metrics for platforms is essentially to figure out what are the things we can do to enable more and more creation of seeds and enable more and correct matching of seeds to consumers. And if you think of a marketplace, it's the product listing, it's something like Kickstarter, it's the project, it's essentially the information or the content that is required for the two sides to interact with each other, for the two sides to take a decision on whether they should go ahead and interact with each other. And it's a fairly simple concept because across different internet businesses, you constantly have the concept of a seed being repeated. And every business may have multiple seeds, but typically, if you think of a business, there's one reason somebody uses that particular platform. If you think of YouTube, clearly the seed is the video. It's not the comment, it's not something else. People go there for the video. So that is essentially what you focus on and build the platform around it. And the reason I try to simplify it and keep it to this is because this is essentially the economics that somebody running a lemonade stand understands. There's supply, there's demand, and you have to essentially match the two sides. And that's why the focus should be on the role, not on the sides. So how do we go about designing a platform business? That's the structure of a platform business that we looked at. How do we design a business like this? If we think of the shift that's happening, and which Jeff Parker was talking about some time back, we're moving from linear business models to network business models. Now, a lot of us have come from a background where we've built the linear businesses. If you were to bring all the business theory down into a line, into one or two lines, the way a linear business is built is you essentially build an end-to-end process for value creation and transfer. And over time, you make that process more and more efficient so that it becomes repeatable at lower costs. So the unit of a linear business is the process. In the same way, the unit of a network business is the interaction between the producer and the consumer. So if it's YouTube, somebody's coming, creating a video, somebody else is voting on the video, somebody else is consuming the video. There's this set of creation, curation, and consumption that's happening, which needs to be repeated over and over, and that's essentially what the business is about. So just to start designing a platform business, the first focus is to figure out what the primary interaction is, who's the producer, who's the consumer, what is that one thing users are going to come here to do, and focus on that interaction. The reason I believe this is important is because very often when we think of platforms, we think that we're out to build technology. And when we think of technology, we think we need to think of the data, we need to think of the features that need to go into it. We start from the technology side, whereas the goal of technology here is essentially just to enable this interaction. So if we lose sight of the interaction, we're just building technology for the sake of technology. And once we focus on this interaction, the way to start the interaction essentially is to start with the seed. What's the information that will be required for that interaction to happen? So if it's a marketplace, you need the product information, you need the price information, and all of that needs to be provided by the seller for the buyer to engage in that transaction. So you need to figure out what is that seed for your particular business that you can start with, and given that seed, who represents supply and demand, and how can you bring them and enable this interaction? Because as a platform, your job is essentially just to enable the interaction. It is not to create technology. Technology is purely a means of scaling this interaction. So if technology doesn't help you create the interaction, you're not building a platform. If you can create the interaction without technology, you're still building a platform. So that's essentially what I believe designing a platform business is about. So all this is fine because you're focused on the interaction and then you build a platform to enable it. But as a business person, what are the various things that are required to enable this interaction? So I break this down into three fairly mutually exclusive layers. The first thing that we need to do is we need to get the two sides in. because we're not creating any value. We need to get both the sides in. And that's essentially where I use the metaphor of magnet. You need to attract two different sides and bring them in and enable them to interact. The second thing is once we have the two sides in, we need to provide them the tools to interact with each other. Now, this is where the technology and the features and all of that comes in. But very often when we start from this, we have no clue of what we are building, and we end up just building really clunky technology. The third thing is that because the internet is such a huge place, if you're remotely successful, you're going to have millions of producers and millions of consumers. So the key value that you generate is your ability to effectively match the producers and the consumers with each other. And that's where data comes into the picture, because that's where platforms enable this matchmaking function at a really highly scalable level. If you think of how platforms existed before the internet, most platforms acted as a matchmaker because they enabled that through aggregation. So essentially, this is a platform. You bring a lot of speakers and a lot of listeners and everybody into a room, and the matchmaking happens. But this can be done at a global scale only on the internet through data. And that's the final role of the platform. So quickly recapping, get the two roles on board, provide them the tools to interact with each other, and use data to match the two sides. That's essentially what building a platform is about once you've figured out what the interaction is. Just digging deeper into each of these, if we think of the first role of the platform, the magnet, essentially, it sounds trivial. It sounds like you just need to you need to market and get some people in. But as we know, as people who have built platforms when they start with little or no value. So very often when I meet an entrepreneur, he gets very excited. I'm building the Airbnb of X. And it sounds very interesting because Airbnb works, but Airbnb of X doesn't work yet. And the problem with that is it's exciting when you think of Airbnb of X at the scale that Airbnb is today. But when you think of Airbnb of X at one user, it sounds like a shitty place to go. Think of this. There's this product which allows you to type exactly 140 characters, but there's nobody to read it. What's the point of using such a product? So that's Twitter. Now, the whole point is that unless you think of the first user and figure out what the first user is going to do on your platform, you are never going to solve the chicken and egg problem. And there are 100 different ways of doing this. It merits a day on its own, and we're already running late, so we'll skip that, but happy to talk about it later. The second thing that platforms need to do is when you have producers and consumers overlapping, when you have something like Twitter, when you have something like YouTube, and more platforms today have overlapping sides, you need to figure out a way to effectively convert consumers into producers. Because, frankly, you don't want to keep spending marketing dollars for the rest of your life. If you're getting enough consumers, you want to convert them into producers over time. So that's something with intent that you need to go after and actually do rather than hope for it to happen. The third thing that's really important in solving the chicken and egg problem is that you are no longer the producer, so you cannot control the production that's happening on your platform. If you're running a TV channel, you can do a set of synthetic contracts and get a lot of content on board. But if you're running YouTube, you need to ensure that every person who creates a video creates more videos, creates videos more often, and that's how you scale production. If you're running eBay, you need to ensure that your sellers don't sell just once, but keep selling repeatedly. If you're running an online community, you need to ensure that there are more discussions being initiated. And so production of seeds, repeat production of seeds, is a critical aspect of building a platform. And all of this is done through the design of incentives, because at the end of the day, we don't own the users. Whether you call them complimenters, whether you call them users, I just like to bunch all of them as producers because that's something a 16-year-old understands. And if you think of producers, you don't own the producers over here. And typically people do things for three reasons. They either enjoy doing it, they get famous doing it, or they make money doing it. And so you need to figure out if you're asking the user to do anything for you, which you'll have to do if you're building a platform. What's in it for the user? Because if there's nothing in it for him, the chicken and egg problem is never going to be solved. So that's what I have to say about the magnet. Quickly moving to the next layer, which is what we all get excited by, the technology part of it. And this is the one on which I have only 2 slides because there's very, very little to say about it. We already know a lot about how to build the technology side. All I want to say over here is that the focus of building technology should not be on technology. The focus should be on the actions that users are supposed to do to interact. So it's just like you can't build a community, you need to create the conditions for existing interactions to come on board. So essentially, this is essentially a place where we as creators need to understand the actions that the producer takes, the actions that the consumer takes, and build the right interfaces, the right incentives for them to take those actions. And that's essentially, at the end of the day, the kind of technology that needs to be built. And as we see more and more platforms being exploding today, if you think of Flickr versus Instagram, a common theme that we see is that as you minimize the costs of production or the barriers, you remove the barriers to production, your platform explodes. So the number of people creating pictures on Flickr, number of people creating pictures on Instagram is vastly different because you just reduced the process of production by 5 steps. And that's a core design principle that needs to be used whenever we're building systems where parties external to us need to come in and contribute. Finally, the most important role of the platform, where it really scales, is its role as the matchmaker. Because, as I said, there are millions of people out there, and if I'm using a dating website and I consistently get matched with the wrong person, I'm not going to use it anymore. If I'm consistently being shown the wrong results on a search page, I'm not going to use that anymore. So the most important thing while running a platform at scale is correct matching, minimizing the false positives. The second thing is that both for the producers and the consumers, it's extremely important that the platform has a clear way of differentiating high quality from low quality. Because a producer is not incentivized if he creating high quality does not get greater exposure. A consumer is not happy if he's consistently served low quality. So curation is extremely important in platforms. Curation is partly done by editors in-house, by employees in-house, and then it's not scalable. But when it's really scalable, it's done by the users. And that's where social curation tools come into the picture. So the second thing to enable matchmaking is figuring out how do you differentiate the low quality from the high quality seeds. And finally, even in real life, when we interact with people, we engage in interactions with people who we trust and in locations that we trust. And so trust is an extremely essential part of running a platform. Trust is partly a data problem because just like curation tells you about high quality versus low quality seeds, trust is a way of differentiating high quality versus low quality producers and consumers. So Airbnb allows you as a host to rate your traveler, and as a traveler to rate your host. And in this way, it builds a reputation for both sides. That's one way of building trust. The second way, as we see in this case with Airbnb again, is that the platform, since it's the overall economic and social planner of the system, needs to provide some kind of minimum guarantee for participating in the system. And that's what Airbnb does with its $1 million insurance. That's what, to some extent, PayPal does with its verified seller listings. So key things for the matchmaker part that I see is that you need to really get the matching algorithms perfectly right. You need to get curation nailed, figure out a really good way of differentiating quality. And finally, you need to build systems that enable trust over time. So that essentially is how I see the whole design of the platform. You have the interaction at the top. So that's the interaction layer. You have a relationship layer. You have a technology layer. And finally, you have a data layer. And frankly, if any of these things get messed up, the whole platform gets messed up. So that at in summary is how I see the platform as a set of building blocks. So that's how you build the minimum viable platform. That's like we just enabled a single simple interaction. We're not building the big things that we've been hearing about all day. So how do you go from building this to building something bigger? Essentially, to build the minimum viable platform, the key is to focus on exactly one interaction. And to build the multi-sided beast that we want to build ultimately, the key is to build it one interaction at a time. Very often we think of building platforms one feature at a time or getting in one market at a time. But the key over here is to build it one interaction at a time. And let me give an example over here of a company that did this really well and had a great IPO and still does really well. So LinkedIn started by connecting professionals with professionals over their profiles. That was the seed. So that was the first interaction, and that helped LinkedIn get off the ground. And then it decided, okay, this is not interesting enough. Let me also get them engaged in conversations. So LinkedIn decided to engage the two in conversations through discussion groups and discussion posts, and that did not work very well. But then LinkedIn decided it wanted to get another side, and so it got in another interaction, which was recruiters putting out job listings and professionals coming and applying for those jobs. And finally, LinkedIn realized it has a problem that Facebook does not have, which is engagement. So LinkedIn identified some people as thought leaders, got a new role built over there, got a new role of people reading what these thought leaders have to say, and enabled a new interaction. So if you think of it, it's really beautiful because the first interaction helped LinkedIn get adoption, solve the first problem. The second interaction helped LinkedIn crack the monetization problem, and the third interaction helped LinkedIn crack the engagement problem. And all of them obviously feed into each other, and that's what makes LinkedIn so powerful today. So that's a way of starting with something very simple. If we start with this image and try to build this image, it gets really complicated. But if we start with one interaction and try to build interactions on top of it, you ultimately end up with this, which is essentially what you started out building. Another principle that I often think of when building platforms is that if you're running a platform business, you need to do a lot of things. I mean, if you're running any business, you need to do a lot of things. But if you're running a platform business, you need to figure out that anything that you do can be done either by your employees, by your algorithms, or by users. And the way to scale is to go down the stack. So think of it this way. When an online community starts, the moderation of comments on that community is initially done by an editor in-house. But as the community grows, you cannot keep doing that. And so what you do is you figure out patterns of moderation and you automate it and you put that out as algorithms. So essentially what happens at the editor's end is only when the algorithm doesn't solve something, something pops up. And then over time, once you figure out super users in your community, you put it out to them. And then again, you feed it back to algorithms, which again become learn more patterns over time. So that's a common and a fairly simplistic methodology of gradually scaling something that you start off in-house and then move out into the community. Because on day one, it's almost impossible to expect everybody else dancing to your tune. And that's why in Silicon Valley, there's this whole thing about you need to hustle, you need to do things that don't scale initially. But over time, you need to scale things. One more concept that I want to talk about very quickly is the concept of extenders. So we talked about 3 different roles that a platform has. A multi-sided platform often starts with performing all 3 roles and then starts getting other parties to do that. So one that we're very common with is the toolbox. Initially, we create all the technology, but then we create the interfaces for the API developers to come in and start putting extensions. Magnet, again, if you think of, the relationship that Android has with Samsung, and Android could have gone and done its Google phone, and that bombed for a variety of reasons. But once you get other parties to manage the relationship layer, that's when you're kind of outsourcing the magnet part to somebody in the ecosystem. And finally, this is something that we talk about very little, but we're getting a lot of big data management services coming up today. And the reason they're coming up today is because platforms need to have data when they start up because they need to connect the two sides. And data usually is very difficult to start with because data, again, has a chicken and egg problem. When you start, you really have no data about users. So that's where you have a lot of big data services coming in, bringing data from across the internet and allowing a new platform to use it for its matching services. So that's the concept of extenders. And the final thing I want to really quickly touch upon is monetization, because there are these hundreds of Instagrams and other things like that coming up, which get everything else right, do not get this right. So what are the design principles that we see in terms of monetization? So again, keeping this really simple, There are 4 common patterns that I see in how platforms successfully monetize. The most common that we see is the marketplace model, which is essentially producers and consumers come on board, they transact, you have a way to capture the transaction, and you take a cut of it. And that's what Eventbrite, Airbnb, eBay, all of these do. What's very important over here is that not every interaction can be controlled in this manner, because you need to ensure that the transaction that is happening on your platform is something that can happen only on your platform. It's something that the producer and consumer cannot just take and do offline and avoid the cut. So you need to ensure that the amount of value that your platform is giving to that transaction is so high that you can capture the transaction. So only in those conditions does this model work. Very often a lot of companies try this and they realize that the transaction is going offline, it's not working. So if that doesn't work, usually what companies do next is that, okay, I can't control the transaction, but I can control access to the other side. So that's what a dating website does. Because in a dating website, you really need to interact with the person offline. So what they do is you can sign up and you can probably view profiles of people for free. But if you want to connect with them, you need to pay for that. Facebook, again, asks you to pay for access. You can write something, get it out there, but if you want more people to see it, promoted posts, you pay for that. So essentially paying for access to the other side. OpenTable is another example where the producers pay for every consumer that gets sent to them via the platform. Finally, if you cannot get the producer and consumer to monetize at all, which is what happens a lot of the times in the Valley, what you end up doing is you end up pasting ads. Now the problem with ads is that very often that's not the reason the consumers and producers are using the platform. And so it distracts them from the core seed that they're coming to consume over there. So if you think of cases where ads have really worked, it's where the ad has an extremely close link and an extremely high overlap with the seed. So if you think of Dribble, Dribble is a place where designers come and share their designs and other designers vote on their designs. So essentially they're sharing their professional designs over there. And since they're there for professional reasons, if you show a job over there, that kind of has an overlap with what is being done over there. LinkedIn, again, professional network, jobs are the ads, works really well for that reason. And the final thing that I want to talk about in terms of monetization is that at the end of the day, we are building technology. So there are cases where we can charge for technology as well. And often charging for technology, charging for access to the platform comes in the way of building network effects. And that's why we have a lot of these companies applying freemium models. Flickr, SlideShare, Vimeo are all cases where producers, if they want to get access to better production tools, need to pay for that. So that essentially, those are the 4 ways of monetizing platforms. Again, as I end this talk, I want to restate this because I can't state this often enough. The fallacy is that we often believe that we are in the business of building functionality. We're in the business of building technology. And all of that is true, but that's not the core reason for existence of the business. We're actually in the business of enabling interactions. And that's what a platform is about. Thank you.